Learning how to cook can be a real challenge for a lot of people. I learned from two main sources. Number one was watching my parents cook and seeing how they did it and how they worked in the kitchen. Number two was Food Network. I mean, can I just say, like, praise God for Chef Emeril. Like, literally show me how to spice it up in the kitchen, you know? That was a food pun, and it will not be the last food pun that we have here today. I'm just gonna chop it up with the food jokes. Just trust me, because if you shut up today, you're in for a real treat. All right. Okay, I'll digress. Learning how to cook can be hard. There were two things that I had a particular hard time with when I was learning how to cook, and the first one was learning how to cook chicken all the way through. Once I figured out meat thermometers was a thing, that really helped, like a lot. So that wasn't too bad. Figured that out. The second thing that I still struggle with a lot of times is getting the seasoning right in a dish. You know what I mean? Maybe you can relate, right? Like you'll have like a pot or a pan of something, a sauce, vegetables, meat, whatever, and you tend to go to one of two extremes. At least I do. And on the one extreme is to over season or over salt the food. You know, it's like Jimmy Buffett. He's looking for his lost shaker of salt, and turns out it was in my dinner last night. Like, I put the whole thing in because I just wanted to make sure that I seasoned it enough. And then you taste it, and it turns out like, man, I didn't know salt was that salty. Like when you put it all together, and it doesn't come out great. You can't over season your food. But on the other extreme, right, which sometimes we have a tendency to do, is where you under season it, where you think, you know, man, this is a whole bit. I don't want to overdo it. Maybe like 3 grains of salt. Like that's probably going to get the job done. Just a little pinch, and then we're good. And then when you taste it, you're like, this tastes like nothing. I don't know what I was thinking. There is zero flavor in this at all. Empty, flavorless calories. Salt is one of our primary seasonings. Because what it does is very basic, right? Is a function in the culinary world. It brings out the flavor in the dish around it. For sweet things, it's just a little bit of salt makes it somehow sweeter. For savory things, adding a little more salt makes it even more savory and enhances the flavors of the dish itself. Salt is a flavor enhancer. And now the reason that I'm talking about salt today is because Jesus used this really interesting illustration when he was talking to his disciples and to his people in what we call the Sermon on the Mount. So if you go into your New Testament, Matthew's, the very beginning of the New Testament, Matthew 5 through 7, that's what we call the Sermon on the Mount. And essentially what the Sermon on the Mount is Jesus' kingdom manifesto. It is the teaching on what it means to live in his kingdom, to live under his reign, rule, and authority, what it means to live as his disciple and as his student in the world. And in Matthew 5, he goes through this list of what we call the Beatitudes, or just people who can be blessed, which, as we realize when Jesus goes through it, is anyone can be blessed. And then as he moves through that list, he then comes to this particular verse we call Matthew 5:13. And he says this. He says, you, speaking to his people, you are the salt of the earth. You are the salt of the earth. But what good is salt if it has lost its flavor? Can you make it salty again? It will be thrown out and trampled underfoot as worthless. See, Jesus is saying that his people are to be salty, right? That they are to add to the dish in the sense of bringing out the best of the flavors that are already there, right? God made a good world. He's not calling for it, and this is a trap that sometimes we fall into, right? Where we think that we need to have this religious, spiritual world over here and the secular world over here. The truth is that reality itself is not secular, right? God made the world and he made it good. And his kingdom is the thing that like is undergirding the entire reality that we experience on a daily life. And even deeper than that, in some sense, it is that the Trinity, the Father, Son, and Spirit, that fellowship of love is at the very ground and center of all reality itself. And so it's just important for us to remember, right? What Jesus is saying is that his people are to be a people who bring out the good that God put in the world, who enhance those flavors that he put there, right? That by our lives, by our character, by our faith, by what he's doing in us, and by who we are becoming as we follow him and becoming who we were made to be, that we would bring out the best in the world around us. Of course, the challenge is that we tend to not be very salty sometimes. Because I want you to pay attention to what Jesus didn't say. He said, you are the salt of the earth. He didn't say, you are the tofu of the earth. Now I know what you're thinking, right? Steve, tofu, come on, right? Tofu, if you don't know, is basically condensed soy milk. It tastes about like condensed soy milk, which is to say that it tastes like nothing, like it doesn't have a taste, which makes it a really versatile, flexible ingredient in cooking. See, we're back on cooking again. I'm sorry, maybe food's on my mind right now. I'm hungry, didn't eat breakfast, I don't know. It's a good ingredient because it is inherently flavorless. So what it does, which is kind of interesting, is it absorbs the flavors of the dish around it. It takes it in. And so it then becomes this really interesting ingredient to use because you can make it taste like a lot of different things. Now, Jesus didn't tell his disciples to be the tofu of the earth. Now, why is that? Why did he say salt? Well, a couple reasons. I'm sure Jesus loved tofu. I just don't think it was the right illustration for this point. So, any of you tofu advocates who are going to get at me about tofu, like just know, hey, all about it. It's totally fine. You do you with tofu. That rhymes, so you'll be cool with it. But it's just not an appropriate illustration, and I hope you'll see why. Here's the thing. Salt enhances the flavors of the dish around it. Salt brings out the good of the food around it. Tofu absorbs. It absorbs the flavors of the dish around it. Salt isn't the star of the dish, right? It necessarily recedes into the background, doesn't it? And kind of elevates other things and pushes them to the forefront. Tofu, in sucking all the flavors out of the food around it, then becomes the star of the dish, doesn't it? It is like the center of the stage. You're not going to have tofu in it, and it's not going to become an important part of that food. And so, what I think that this matters, as we'll see here, is that the story that we come to in the end of the book of Judges is an illustration of this point of Jesus's command and his invitation for his people to be the salt of the earth, not the tofu of the earth, which I hope by the time we get to the end of this, you'll see what I mean and see how this in particular makes sense. In this series, we've been going through the book of Judges, looking at how we make sense of living in what we're calling a post-wilderness world. We really wander through the existential wilderness of the pandemic year and that just won't seem to quite go away, and then move into the future world, right, on the other side of that. Of course, the reality is that we see as we look at the book of Judges is that in some ways, the existential crisis of the wilderness doesn't really go away, right? It just kind of drags on like this never-ending pandemic of crisis, And so as we're coming to the end of the book of Judges itself, not necessarily the end of this series, there's a couple other stories that in the Old Testament that fall in this same time period, like Ruth and Samuel, which we're going to look at in the next couple weeks. But we're going to end the book of Judges today, Judges 19 to 21. And one of the things that I think is so interesting about this story that we'll find here is that I see it as an illustration of what Jesus is talking about in the Sermon on the Mount. Now, be forewarned up front, this is not like a great story. It's definitely PG-13, so, if you got any little kiddos watching, just keep that in mind. And it's pretty graphic. And, this is saying something for the book of Judges. It's maybe one of the worst stories in the book of Judges. Which is interesting because the writer of Judges, who we don't know exactly who it is, some scholars think it may have been the ancient rabbis said it was Samuel, who we'll look at in future installments, the sort of last judge and transition into the kingdom of Israel. Some people think it was Samuel. Scholars will say there's maybe these different historians that assembled at different parts, but whoever it is that wrote the book of Judges itself, they make an interesting moral commentary on the events in Judges 19 through 21, and they bring it back to this line that was repeated a lot last week we looked at, and has been repeated throughout this entire book. This is how the story begins in Judges 19. Now in those days, Israel had no king. So just saying like, hey, keep in mind what's about to happen. Just a little asterisk beside it, okay? In those days, Israel had no king. There was a man from the tribe of Levi living in a remote area of the hill country of Ephraim. One day he brought home from Bethlehem in Judah a woman to be his concubine. There's a lot we could say in general that we haven't really talked about like concubines in the Old Testament, and about polygamy, multiple wives in the Old Testament. It definitely gets very complicated. The thing that I think is always helpful for us is to read the Old Testament through the lens of Jesus and see how he talked about it. So when Jesus talks about marriage, and as the later rabbis talked about marriage, they go back to Genesis and see this picture of, and quote Genesis 2, right? For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This picture of a man and a woman being united in a covenantal marriage relationship. That's a unique thing. But what we see throughout the Old Testament, particularly in this period before what we call the exile, the patriarchs with Abraham and those stories, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then the Exodus stories with Moses in the wilderness, and then Judges on through the saga of the kings. Polygamy is pretty common, but not approved necessarily. Does that make sense? It's a little complicated from that standpoint. Specifically, this idea of having a concubine. So in the ancient world, a concubine was essentially like having a civil kind of partnership. It was similar to being married, but without all of the legal benefits of being married. So again, a sort of complicated relationship. But this Levite, we're told, takes a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah and takes her back to his home in the hill country of Ephraim. Apparently, that didn't last very long, because after 4 months, she was, quote, unfaithful to him and leaves him to return to her family in Bethlehem. Maybe out of shame, maybe out of just displeasure, who knows what is going on here, but she leaves, goes back home. The husband, this Levite, goes back to Bethlehem to retrieve her. He has this big back and forth with her dad. After a week of staying there, he eventually is allowed to leave with his wife, this woman who goes unnamed, but who is his concubine, his wife for all intents and purposes. And so they leave to go back home to his actual house in the hill country. So traveling north, day or two journey northward. We're told that as they leave Bethlehem, it's late in the afternoon on this particular day, which is a little challenging when they leave late in the afternoon because of things like having no electricity. And so, that makes it tough to travel. It's a little dangerous at night in the ancient world. Not just animals, but people can be a little dangerous. So they were leaving Bethlehem, which is about 6 miles south of modern Jerusalem. In that particular time period of the Judges, Jerusalem wasn't yet Jerusalem. It was a city called Jebus. And in it lived these people called the Jebusites, right? These people who lived in Jebus. The city of Jerusalem wouldn't properly become the capital of Israel until the reign of King David. I mean, several generations after these events. So as this Levite is traveling back to his home with his wife, and they're going northward, his servant says, "Hey, let's stop in Jebus for the night." The Levite says, "No way." Quote, "We won't go into any city whose people are not Israelites. We will go on to Gibeah." I think part of the reasoning here is that there's an expectation the people of Israel will extend hospitality. There will be a certain kind of grace involved. I don't want to read too much kind of modern sort of racial tension into that. But of course, keep in mind, the ancient world is extremely racist because everything was divided along ethnic, tribal lines in a lot of respects. But that the world that God was making and who he called the people of Israel to be was to be a people who would be a blessing to all the peoples of the earth, all the different ethnic groups, all the different tribes. Fascinating, very countercultural thing that God is doing in the world. So anyway, this Levite says, we ain't stopping in Jebus, we'll go on to Gibeah, which was a much further journey. And so onward they go. We're told, quote, the sun was setting as they came to Gibeah, a town in the land of Benjamin, the tribal territory of Benjamin. So they stopped there to spend the night. They rested in the town square, but no one took them in for the night, which is interesting because even in that culture, regardless of who anyone was, right, that is a shocking lack of hospitality. Shocking lack of hospitality, but especially within the people of Israel who were commanded, right, by God to extend grace and hospitality and generosity, especially to strangers. Yes, to your own family, yes, to loved ones, yes, to your fellow Israelites, but especially to strangers and foreigners who are moving among you and in your territory. And so this Levite and his wife and his servants, and they go into this city, Gibeah, and no one gives them a place for the night. And so they're sitting in the town square, setting up camp for the night, I suppose, hoping that someone would invite them in, because they didn't really do like Holiday Inn Express in the ancient world, believe it or not. So they're out in the town square when an old farmer comes in from the country. After many hours of them sitting out, it was now past dark, and he invites the entire entourage into his home for a meal and to stay for the night. He says, look, no one's invited you in for the night. What are you doing out here? They said, no one's invited us. He says, well, you come to my house. Just don't stay out here tonight. So he brings them into his house, and during dinner, this is what we're told, that some of the wicked men in the city surrounded the house. Pounding on the door, they shouted to the old man who owned the house, bring out the man who came to your house so we can have sex with him. The old man, the farmer, replies and says, no, you may not do this. And so instead, he offers his daughter, his virgin daughter, and the man's concubine to the crowd who's beating on the door, demanding to have sex with this man who has come into town. The crowd refuses to listen and just keeps beating on the door, calling out all the more loudly. Now, this might sound kind of weird to you, but what I want you to do is to just picture what you just heard. And if you want to go back and read this, you can find it in Judges 19. But then maybe flip back over to the story in Genesis 19. It's a story where there's these two angels who go into the city of Sodom to find Abraham's nephew, his dear nephew Lot, and Lot's family. And when they go into the city of Sodom, they go into the town square, no one offers them in, but Lot, this righteous man who says, no one offered you hospitality, come and stay in my home. Lot brings these men into his home, and then the townsfolk come and beat on the door and say, send out the men so that we can have sex with them, which is weird, but it's the ancient world, and sometimes they were a lot less filtered than we are in our world today. Not that we're better than they are, just that we have some different laws and legal things in place that don't allow things like that to happen quite as regularly. So they're demanding for these two men, for Lot to send them outside. Lot refuses, offers his daughter. The men refuse that as well, and then ultimately God intervenes in that story. So what we're hearing here in Judges is meant to be, I think, a direct echo of that story in Genesis, to remind us of who the people of Israel were called to be, of what hospitality was meant to look like. But what I think we should pay attention to is that in the Old Testament, right, and really throughout the entire biblical story, and even in many respects filtered down through cultural tradition, Sodom and Gomorrah become paradigmatic of wickedness and evil, of not just sexual sin, right? I mean, there's an element of that and of abuse there, but also of what it looks like when you do not have the appropriate attitude toward visitors, towards guests, towards strangers, with hospitality and violence and misplaced and disordered desires. I mean, all these things kind of swirling around in this just crock pot of sin, you know? So what we hear is this echo of Sodom, except it's happening in Israel's territory, in the tribe of Benjamin, in Gibeah, one of the main cities in the land of Benjamin, which should be like even more shocking that this is so contrary to who the people of Israel were called to be. And it was very similar to the way that the cultures around them operated, but so different from who God was calling them and inviting them to be. So in this story, there's this tension that's happening, and the men are beating on the door, and we kind of wonder, okay, is God going to bring a deliverance like he did in the Genesis story, in the story of Lot and Sodom and his deliverance from there? Perhaps that could have happened if the people involved were not different. I mean, one of the challenges that we sometimes face is when we look at the stories in the book of Judges and we may compare them to other stories in the Bible, and we say, well, how come God saved someone here but not here? I think very often it has to do with the character of the individuals involved and who they are and the choices and decisions that they're making, right? So like Lot was a righteous man who genuinely was going to care for the people around him, and who God was thus going to save from the destruction of Sodom. As we find out, the characters in this story, such as the Levite, maybe aren't quite the same, because listen to what happens next. We're told that the Levite, as the men are beating on the door saying, "Send out the man," the Levite, "Send out this Levite that we may have sex with him," the Levite took hold of his concubine and shoved her out the door. Like, don't hurt me, take her instead, is exactly what he does. So he shoves her out the door, and this is what we're told, and I quote from the text, Judges 19, "The men of the town abused her all night, taking turns raping her until morning. Finally at dawn they let her go. At daybreak the woman returned to the house where her husband was staying. She collapsed at the door of the house and lay there until it was light. When her husband opened the door to leave, there lay his concubine with her hands on the threshold. He said, 'Get up, let's go.' But there was no answer. So he put her body on his donkey and took her home." I mean, what? Like, that is a shocking and shameful story for many reasons, right? Like the Levite's actions, what the men of Gibeah did, just the terror of that whole experience, that she was like, beating at the door saying, "Let me back in," like, and that no one did anything. And that they were inside and heard everything that was happening literally right outside the door. And no one did anything to stop it. And that this Levite, after a good night's sleep, comes out and is like, "All right, let's go, come on." But she's dead. Which is this is like a mind-blowing story for the people, and I think what we should pay attention to is that it does get worse. Okay, so hang with me. We're told that when he got home, he then took a knife and cut his concubine's body into 12 pieces, which is, if it wasn't bad enough what he did to her, now the dishonor of dismembering her and cutting her into 12 pieces. And he sent one piece to each tribe throughout all the territory of Israel, probably with a note. It said, "Everyone who saw it said, 'Such a horrible crime has not been committed in all the time since Israel left Egypt. Think about it. What are we going to do, and who is going to speak up?'" And so the entire nation assembles at this place called Mizpah, all the tribes before the ark of the Lord, and the tribal elders of the 12 tribes, except the tribe of Benjamin, they all assemble and gather and have the Levite tell them the story. And then he proceeds to tell them the story, assumingly the right story, the true story, verbatim, telling them about his conduct and everything that happened. And this is what they declare. It said, "All the people rose to their feet in unison and declared, 'None of us will return home. No, not even one of us.' So all the Israelites were completely united, and they gathered together to attack the town of Gibeah." Shocked with what happened in their own tribal territory, and said, "This simply will not be so. We will not tolerate this. We won't stand for it. This is not who we were called to be." They send a message then to the elders of Benjamin. telling them to answer for the crime that had been done in their territory, to hand over the ringleaders of these men in Gibeah to stand justice. That this was a wrong thing that had been done, and they need to answer for their crime. The men of Benjamin respond by sending an army to Gibeah to defend the city. 30,000 men go to Gibeah to set up defense of the city in preparation for the assembled 11 tribes sending their collective army to Gibeah to besiege it and to bring out the men who had perpetrated this crime. And so the ultimate outcome of this was civil war. But maybe we just need to pause there and ask the question, why? Why did this happen? How did it come to this? Why is this? It is shocking the way that this story has unfolded up until this point, and that it is going to be resolved with some kind of civil war is just perhaps even more shocking. And so what we're told is that on day one, the Israelites attack the town of Gibeah, where the Benjamites are defending it, and the Israelites are repulsed. Lose thousands of men on this day. On day two, they do the same thing and same result. Thousands lost, and Benjamin still holds the city. On the third day, we're told that they attack again, and after fasted and wept and consulted the Lord, they set an ambush. They have some kind of feint maneuver where they attack and then pull back and draw the Benjamites out of the city, and then the guys that they sit in the rear ambush, and they go in and they burn the city, and then they meet in the middle and they just crush the tribe of Benjamin. It's classic, great military maneuvers, really job well done, guys. But this is the outcome. We're told that on that day, the tribe of Benjamin lost 25,000 warriors armed with swords, leaving only 600 men, who then escaped to the rock of Rimmon, where they lived for 4 months. And the Israelites returned after killing 25,000, driving 600 men of the Benjamites out of the city and out of their own territory. The army of Israel returned and slaughtered every living thing in all the towns of Benjamin. And slaughtered every living thing in all the towns of Benjamin. All the people, all the livestock, and everything they found. They also burned down all the towns they came to. This is another one of those stories, right? Within the book of Judges, where no one is in the right, which makes it hard. And I think is one of the challenges that many people have when they read the Old Testament in particular, and they look at some of the stories, in particular these stories of violence in the Old Testament, and our tendency is to say, well, it's in the Bible, and so that means that it's good. But here again, right, remember, in those days, Israel had no king, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And so you can take a step back and be like, no one is right, actually. None of this is objectively good or right. Where this is horrendous actions taken by everyone on all sides. And that is just, it's hard to read, but I think we just have to acknowledge that and be honest and open about it at the beginning. After the battle, we're told that there was something of a kind of a moral reckoning for the Israelites. It says they felt sorry for their brother Benjamin and said, "Today one of the tribes of Israel has been cut off, and this is a shameful thing for us. How can we find wives for the few who remain, since we have sworn by the Lord not to give them our daughters in marriage?" So they felt bad because they destroyed essentially one entire tribe from the nation of Israel, their brothers, their family. And so they say, okay, well, we'll give them wives so that they can repopulate and the tribe can be restored. The problem was they said, we're not going to give them our daughters, so where are we going to get women from? So this is what they do. They realize that the town of Jabesh Gilead, which is across the Jordan River, they didn't come to the assembly. And so they said, you know what? You snooze, you lose, boys. Let's go there and take all the women from their town and give them to the tribe of Benjamin. And so that's exactly what they do. They take 400 women from Jabesh Gilead, a small town east of the Jordan, and then they find another 200 women from a festival outside of the town of Shiloh, where the Ark of the Lord was kept periodically throughout this time. And then they give these wives to the tribe of Benjamin so that Benjamin can repopulate. And we're told that then everyone went back to their allotted territory and they lived. Not really happily ever after, but they did live from this point on. And this is how the text actually ends, the book of Judges. It says, at that time, the Israelites left that place and went home to their tribes and clans, each to his own inheritance. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. And thus ends the book of Judges. In the end, I think when we take a look back at the entire book that we've been working through, we see that it's a story, and the writer makes this point right in that last verse. It's a story about the failure of subjective morality and collective anarchy. It's a story of what happens when there is no king. I'm not talking about a political system, okay? But when there is no king, no central authority that is governing the ethics of the people, and what happens when everyone does what is right in their own eyes. Because remember who the people of Israel were meant to be. They were meant to be different. They were meant to be a people who reflected God's glory in the world, who had God as their king, who heard his words and put it into practice, who heard the word of the Lord that was true and right and did the right thing based on the word that they heard, as opposed to just doing whatever looked right to them in the moment. That's the difference that's going on here. And I just think it's important for us to remember that when there was rebellion to God's lawful kingship, it's not, things will not go well, especially over time. Things may seem to go well for a moment or for a period of time, but over the course of time, things will consistently not look good. Which I think is important for us to remember when we talk about, kind of at an individual or a collective level for us today. When, as individuals, we don't follow Jesus and we live in such a way that is contrary to the kingdom of God. You might say, like, we live not in accordance with God's will for how human beings best function. It's that bad things will come from that. Sin and death will result from that. And then the more of us that do that, the worse it sort of gets, really. And which that shouldn't then be a surprise to us when you look in the world around us and you see so many of the challenges that we face as a society and realize that this is the result of us as a people, collectively, as individuals, and then as a group who are not living in accordance with God's way. And I know that sometimes that kind of language has been used to demean certain groups of people or to try to explain certain things happening in the world as God's judgment upon the people. We're a new covenant people. We believe in Jesus and what he said and what he was mediating into the world. But it is important to remember that actions have natural consequences. And when we do not live in the way that God said was best for human beings to live and to function, it does create a lot of problems. It really does. And I think we see the fruit of that, right? A great example of this is something like the racial tension in the world today, right? Like when we enslave other human beings, that creates a lot of challenges and there's resentments. And we look over the course of hundreds of years, there is a trajectory that is directing us in a path that is maybe not the best way for human beings to flourish, And so all that to say is that we have to keep this in mind, right? That we're talking about here in the book of Judges and in our life is not decisions that happen over the course of a day or a week, but it's about trajectories, right? And that what God is doing is he is pointing all of humanity, directing all of humanity towards this place where heaven and earth are joined together again, fully as they were made to be in the very beginning, where the knowledge of the glory of the Lord fills the earth as waters cover the sea, where Jesus is reigning upon this earth, where we have a new creation, where creation has been restored and redeemed in all its fullness. That's kind of picture that we're aiming towards, and how often we miss the mark, right? Which is the word that the New Testament uses for sin. We miss the aim, right? We fall short so often, which is essentially what we call sin, right? That's what sin is. And I think it's even more challenging, right? When we see it broadly in the world, in people's lives, there is a sense that there is something wrong and that the world is not functioning the way it is meant to. But there is perhaps an even stronger sense in which when it is the people of God who are defined and identified by him, who then miss the mark dramatically, It's when they miss the mark so severely that there is a deeper sense of a violation and a wrongness that's happening, which is what's happening in the story in the book of Judges. Remember, these are the people of Israel, God's covenant people. They were meant to be very different. We hear these words in Exodus. This is who they were meant to be. When God makes a covenant with them at Mount Sinai, this is what he says. He says, "Now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all the nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." Or these words that God gave to Abraham much earlier, explaining the similar kind of thing. He said, "Abraham, I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you. I will curse those who curse you, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you and your descendants." Or even later, during the reign of the kings from the prophet Isaiah, this is who the people of Israel were called to be. It says, "I, the Lord, have called you in righteousness. I will take hold of your hand. I will keep you and will make you to be a covenant for the people and a light for the Gentiles." You see the picture here that God is trying to paint for the people is that if you live in relationship with me, you will be a different people. You will live in such a way that you bring out the best in people. You will live in such a way that you are a light to the world around you. You will live in such a way that you will bless the world through your life. That is who the people of God are called to be, because the whole earth is his. He made the whole thing, and it's good. And he has a plan for it to redeem it in totality. And he is inviting human beings to come to him and in partnership and relationship with him to then be the ones who help put that world back to the way it was always meant to be, but that has been marred and destroyed and scarred by sin. Which is why Jesus comes and he tells people that there is a way to be human. And that way is not a bunch of religious rules. It's not simply checking boxes. It's not believing a certain kind of religion. The way is to follow me. The way is to take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble at heart. The way, Jesus says, is to live in relationship with me, loving relationship, receive my very life in you, and to then exercise that authority upon the earth as my students, as my disciples. And this community that Jesus is forming, this community of his kingdom, of his disciples being brought together, is what we call the church. Which is why Jesus then says, "You are the salt of the earth. But if salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot and should not be hidden." And so what we look at in this story, in particular throughout the entire book of Judges, we maybe just pause right here towards the end and ask the question, what actually happened? Well, I'll tell you what happened. Israel wasn't salty. Israel was tofu. They absorbed the flavors of the culture around them. They absorbed everything from the evil, wicked practices of the world around them, the things that God was sending them to transform. Instead, they were conformed to those practices and became just like every other people around them. They were tofu. And that was not who God called them to be. When you look at the sins in particular in this story, right? The idolatry, the forming of graven images, the dishonoring of parents, abuse of the land, murder, civil war, adultery, theft, rape, lying, covetousness. Look, it's like they took the covenant, the 10 Commandments, and they just ripped it in half and said, "We don't care about you, God." Except in probably stronger language that I can't really say on like a church YouTube page. But that's like essentially what they said, right? They do not care about him. And of course, we look at that and we can see there's something wrong here. And the writer of Judges can look at that and say, in those days, Israel had no king. And everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And this was a problem. This was not a good thing. But sometimes it's hard for us to then kind of turn the mirror on us and realize that very often, like as the church, we can be tofu. right? Where we end up looking just like the world around us. The divisiveness, the politicization of literally everything, the anger and the vitriol and the hatred and the unkind speech, the harsh judgmentalism, the pride and the arrogance, the lack of love. I mean, you look at the world around us, and very often the church looks not very different. And frankly, it is even more problematic when there are people who are leaders within the church who are living in such a way that is deeply out of alignment with the biblical vision for humanity and who God calls us to be. When the church is tofu, the entire world is in a worse place, right? The whole dish itself is brought down. It's not elevated. We're to be salt, right? To enhance the flavor of the world around us, to add value to the world around us, and in many ways to recede from view. You know, that when the church is at its best, it's not like the most visible thing in the world. It's just that people are living truly their best life. Not whatever they think is their best, but they are living truly the best life that there could be. And it is because the church is adding that value and seasoning their life in a meaningful and powerful way. And the way that happens is not necessarily through programs, though programs can sometimes be useful, but the way that it happens is when you, as a follower of Jesus, because the church is not a building or an institution, the church is a people. It's a collection of people. So this happens when you, as a follower of Jesus, live out your calling in the course of your daily life. That you live as someone who's mediating the loving presence of God and his wise stewardship into the world. That you live as someone who is blessing the people around you in the course of your life, everywhere that you go. In your work, in your office, in your school, in your grocery store, whatever it is that you're doing, in your gym, wherever you may be, that you are this kind of person in the world, adding salt to the dish of the world around you, enhancing the good, being a positive, encouraging voice, not just a harsh, condemning, critical reflection of the world around you. Be salt, not tofu. When the church is tofu, it draws the wrong kind of spotlight to itself. And I think sometimes over the course of the last year, we've seen what this looks like. But when the church is salt, the world is a better place. And I think this is frankly one of the challenges that our world collectively has, and that why governmental solutions will not fix the problems that are happening in the world, is because they can only legislate, but they do not address human beings in the way that they need to most be addressed, which is the heart and the mind and the soul and the body, and all of that being brought together in terms of what we call like spiritual formation or human character formation. And that government laws and programs and legislation cannot ever address that and touch those deepest things within human beings. But that's what who the church is called to be salt in the world, to add seasoning, to enhance the flavor, to bring out the good in the world around us, and to point everyone to the goodness of God, and to funnel the world, to bring the world along with us on that trajectory towards the fullness of God's kingdom being upon the earth. That's who we are called to be. So as you go about your life this week, if you take nothing else from today, take this. Be salt, not tofu. Be salt, not tofu. I'm going to pray for you, and then we'll get on our way today. Father, I thank you for the opportunity to be in this place, to share these things via technology. Thank you for everyone who is committed and made it this far and watched to this point. I pray that you would bless them where they are. Enable them by your Spirit to be a salty person in the world, to be someone who enhances the lives of people around them, who brings good to the world around them, who enhances the good that's around them in the world every day and elevates that. Enable them to do so. For all the times that we have been tofu and that we have absorbed the practices and the ideas and the cultures of our world that are so negative sometimes, we repent of that. We turn away from it and we turn our eyes back towards you, Jesus. We set our hearts and our minds above on your kingdom, and we set our eyes on you, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. We pray that you would lead us in the way that we're to go. that we would not depart from it at any point in the course of this week. Help us to be salt of the earth today. And we pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, I just want y'all to know that I love you. I'm praying for you. If there's anything you need, do reach out and let me know. You can find all the links in this post below. You can check our social channels or subscribe to our email list. We're doing a series coming up where we're taking questions. So if there's ever been a question that someone's asked you that you haven't been able to answer, that would be a great question to send to us. We'd love to help you answer questions for the people in your life, to help you be salt in the world. So keep that in mind. Reach out. Let us know if you got any questions that you would like to see addressed here. Ask us anything, and we'll do our best to give you a satisfactory, thoughtful, compelling answer to those questions. Y'all stay safe out there. Have a great week. Make a great day, and we will catch you here next time.